The preacher's Sunday sermon was, forgive your enemies. Towards the end of the service, he asked everybody, do you forgive your enemies? About half the hands went up. The preacher kept on preaching on, and this time it was lunchtime, and he said, do you forgive your enemies? This time 80% of the hands went up, and they forgave their enemies. And he kept preaching on. And this time everybody's hand went up, and enough of the preaching already, except one sweet little elderly lady in the back. Mrs. Sawyer, inquired the preacher, are you not willing to forgive your enemies? You don't have any enemies, Mrs. Sawyer. That's remarkable. May I ask, Mrs. Sawyer, how old are you?
I'm 90
years. Oh, Mrs. Sawyer, God bless you. Mrs. Sawyer, what a gift you are to this congregation. May I be so kind as to ask you how you don't have any enemies in the world?
Well, it's very easy. I outlived the bastard.
This is an encore performance. Some of you saw the original. I tried to find a new joke with Georgie, but all her jokes are so off-color that that was the only one we could find that was PG rated. So it's also an important message, and only she could get away with saying that in here. It's an important message, right? That none of us get through life without feeling like we have enemies, because enemies are real. Enemies exist, right? We see them all around us. We saw them this past year, enemies abounding, like the enemies, the Tsarnaev brothers that bombed the Boston Marathon. Enemies surrounding Israel right now. Just open up your newspaper, read about enemies. Enemies who opened fire in elementary schools this past year. The deadliest school in this deadliest year in this country's history to be a student in an elementary school. And we're going to talk about enemies. We're going to take enemies head on, but that's Yom Kippur. That's not right now. Rosh Hashanah, right now, we're going to actually go in the opposite direction because we overuse the word enemies and hate and evil. We have enemies, there is hatred, there is evil in the world, but by and large it's in our collective lives. It's in the larger world towards us as a community, as Zionists, as Americans, as Israelis. But personally, how many of us truly have enemies in our lives? And yet we use this phrase, he's my enemy, she's my enemy, I hate her, I hate him, they are evil. Right? When we speak about our friends, our family, our colleagues, our community, Jewish communities, we have to be very conscientious of the language we use and the sentiments that we feel and the message that we put out into the world, especially with Jewish community, especially now. Every month, Jews around the world have the blessing over the new month, Mevarchin HaChodesh. And every month we say, Chaverim Kol Yisrael, right? That all Jews are friends. And every month I think, really? The rabbis were so pragmatic and realistic. And yet what were they thinking? Chaverim Kol Yisrael, all Jews are friends? Everybody knows Jews, Jewish communities, Jewish histories, right? Two Jews, three opinions. Every community has two synagogues. The one you belong to and rarely go to, and the one you don't belong to and wouldn't be caught dead in. And every epoch in Jewish history has had more than its share of Jews at one another's throats. And I believe that's why we read yesterday's Torah portion and today's Torah portion, because the rabbis wanted us to take a long, hard look at real life, at family mishigas, at community mishigas. What did we read about yesterday? We read about Abraham and Sarah and real life marital strife. And we read about Isaac and Ishmael, two brothers who simply can't get along. And we read about Hagar and Sarah, two friends who have a falling out. Today we read about a father and a son who become estranged, never to speak again after the Akedah. Yesterday, Hannah and her strife within her family. The rabbis chose these, I believe, not because they wanted us to have theological debates or philosophical exploration or mystical contemplation, not on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is about good old-fashioned family mishigas, right? This isn't just an ancient holy document. It's also an ancient unholy soap opera documenting what happens when family mishigas escalates into communal struggles, turns into tribal feuds, and then escalates into all-out war. We have so many examples of this, sadly, throughout Jewish history, right? Not just in the Torah. We're coming up really quickly on Hanukkah, right? First time in my lifetime, in any of our lifetime, it overlaps with Thanksgiving, which is another conversation entirely. Hanukkah isn't just the story of a miracle of lights, it's also the story of a Jewish civil war. Jews were at one another's throats. Europe, 18th century, you have the Misnagdim, the rationalists, versus the Hasidim, the mystics, at one another's throats. You have in the 19th century, all throughout Europe, the early Zionists versus the early anti-Zionists at one another's throats. In America, in the 20th century, you have Eastern European immigrants versus Western European immigrants. You have Reform Judaism snubbing Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy vilifying conservative. The list goes on and on. So many examples of different generations and Jews at one another's throats. Everything from disdain, disgust, to bans literally forbidding marriage between the two groups. Recently I read about Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews, throwing garbage at Israeli soldiers. About a month or two ago, Israeli police arrested conservative Jewish women. Arrested them. Why? Because they wanted to daven. They wanted to pray wearing a talit, a prayer shawl, at the kotel, at the wall. They were arrested and put in jail for just wanting to be Jews and do what Jews do. Rocks being thrown by ultra-Orthodox Jews at secular Jews. Why? Because the secular Jews in Israel want to drive on Shabbat. Those of you who have attended an AIPAC conference know just how painful this is in D.C. Every year, there's ultra-Orthodox Jews outside the convention center. Ultra-Orthodox Jews holding up signs calling those of us on the inside Nazis, equating us to Adolf Hitler because we're pro-Zionist, because we support the state of Israel. This Sunday is called Tzom Gedalia, the Fast of Gedalia, and it commemorates the last governor of Judea who lived 2,000 years ago, and it commemorates, sadly, the fact that he was murdered by a fellow Jew. We have too many examples of this throughout Jewish history, of Jews murdering Jews, as recently as 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin of blessed memory was murdered by Yigal Amir and Mach Shemo, may his name be forgotten. It's hard enough to understand how B'nai Abraham, the children of Abraham, the Jews and the Muslims, are still at war thousands of years later, but it's even harder, it's impossible to understand how B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, the Jewish people, speak like this to one another, behave like this to one another, and even go so far as to murder fellow Jews. How can this be? Why should this be? Or in the words of the late, great Rodney King, why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all just get along? The rabbis tell us why we can't get along, and to do so, they take us back 2,000 years to the year 70 CE in the Talmud, and they describe a party, just an ordinary party by a host we don't know his name, but we know that he sent his servant out to do all the invites. And one of the people he was going to invite, his name was Kamsa, a friend of his named Kamsa. The servant made a mistake and invited Kamsa's son, Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa and the host were mortal enemies. Bar Kamsa nonetheless showed up, and the host didn't want him in the party. He said, "Get out of my party." Bar Kamsa was a little embarrassed. The rabbis were there. The community was there. It was a big deal. He said, "I'll pay for myself." The host said, "Over my dead body." He said, "I'll pay for half the party. Please don't embarrass me." Host said, "No way." Bar Kamsa said, "I'll pay for the entire party," at which point the host took Bar Kamsa, threw him out in front of the rabbis, in front of the community, as nobody said a word. Bar Kamsa was upset, understandably, but I don't think he was so upset that he meant to do what he did. What did he do? He went to the Roman authorities and reported on the Jews, and it set in motion a chain of events that the rabbis say ultimately led to the Romans destroying Israel, destroying Jerusalem, destroying the Holy Temple, and set in motion the 2,000-year exile because of what the rabbis call sinat chinam, senseless hatred between fellow Jews. We've had 3 exiles in our history, and the rabbis say all 3 exiles didn't happen because of our enemies. They happened because of us, ourselves, because Jews turned on fellow Jews. In almost every era this has happened. No enemy has ever been able to destroy us. The Egyptians couldn't destroy us. The Romans couldn't destroy us. The Babylonians couldn't destroy us. Nazis couldn't destroy us. They didn't have to, because in every single generation we have tried to destroy ourselves. From the time of the Torah to the time of the temple to today, when movements turn on other movements, when Jewish institutions fight other Jewish institutions, when it is synagogue versus synagogue, when it is Jew versus Jew, what begins as sinat chinam, senseless hatred, always ends in sorrow, in suffering, in despair, and even in death. Or in the words of Abraham Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So here we are again. I've spoken about it before, and I'm speaking about it now, and I hope to never speak about it again. But I have to speak about it because it is the single most important issue of my rabbinate. It is the single most important issue that this Jewish community has ever faced. And these are the questions for which we are on the hook to our children or our grandchildren. What will be of this Jewish community? What will be in a generation or two? What will this community look like? And what will it be like? And what will this Jewish community, most of all, act like? Every year we return to this talk because every year the stakes are escalating and the tension is mounting and the emotions are building and the resentment is growing and sinat chinam, senseless hatred, is brewing. I cannot be like those rabbis who sat in silence. You cannot be like those community members who just watched and did nothing and said nothing and allowed sinat chinam, senseless hatred, to spread throughout their Jewish community. Our house in this Jewish community on the North Shore, frankly across America and the world, is divided, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. Yes, CJP has arrived this year, and it is a tremendous breakthrough. It is fantastic. Thank you to Shep Remus and Amanda Clayman and all the others who worked diligently to make this merger happen. Thank you. But it's not enough, right? Because I still hear so much talk about us versus them. I hear questioning and doubting. I hear animosity, us Jews over here versus those Jews across the bridge. Yes, we need to invest our time and our money and our energy into CJP, our Jewish Federation, but most of all, we need to invest our best efforts and best self to bridge the gap. It ain't the Sinai Desert between here and there, it's the Zakim Bridge. It's time to cross that bridge. It's time for Chaverim Kol Yisrael, for all Jews to be brothers and sisters. It's time for us to truly open our hearts and collaborate with CJP. It's time for us to be friends. And Cohen Hillel down the street is trying to reposition itself in this community, and we at Shirat Hayam are going to do everything in our power to make sure they are repositioned and poised for greatness. And we're going to collaborate and partner with them in the coming year and years. However, every year when it comes to Cohen Hillel, I see more apathy, and I hear more negativity, and I even sense opposition. I don't sense it. I'm told there's opposition. My kids will never be a part of that institution, someone once explained when I talked about a collaboration in the works. It's not my problem what's happening at Cohen Hillel, that they're getting smaller. My kids don't go there. What does it matter to me, I heard this past year, if we don't have a Jewish day school? If we don't have a Jewish day school in this community, start your stopwatches, because it's the beginning of the end. Right? They deserve to go under, somebody's told me, because they didn't start their strategic planning 10 years earlier. I invited somebody to go to the Cohen Hillel Gala in a few weeks, and they said, why am I going to go to the gala? It's not my institution, not my concern, they're not my friends. First of all, they're honoring our president and his wife, Karen and David Rosenberg, but beside the point, they are our community. They are our chaverim. They are our friends. This is going to be a year when we support Cohen Hillel, because chaverim kol Yisrael, friends reach out and support other friends. And that brings us to synagogues in this community. Hear me loud and clear on this. Every synagogue on the North Shore has suris. Suris struggles to varying degrees, but suris nonetheless Almost every single synagogue, probably every synagogue, has had merger winks, merger nods, merger flirtations, merger conversations, but nobody wants to talk about it. Until the journal does an expose on it, nobody even knows about it because there's a silence, an ugly silence that enshrouds this conversation in this community, and this silence, in my opinion, is the problem itself. It embodies sinat chinam, this silence. It's subtle, but it is senseless, and it is hatred nonetheless. Mark my words, this year, synagogues will close their doors. They'll fold up shop, at least a couple. In the coming years, more will follow. If we stay on this path that this community is headed, in a generation or two, it'll be a mere shadow, a fragment of what it once was or what it is today. And we cannot allow that to happen. Shirat Hayam, by the way, is not out of the dark. We have our struggles, our tsuris as well. We're growing bigger, we're getting younger, we're thriving. There is a revolution of Jewish spirit growing out of Shirat Hayam, but we have our challenges. And Joe Selby and David Rosenberg, our co-presidents, will be talking about some of those challenges on Yom Kippur. But regardless of our challenges, right, it reminds me of the Midrash. A man begins to dig a hole in a boat under his seat. His fellow passengers protest, and he says, "What concern is it of yours? It's my seat, it's my hole." To which they, of course, respond, "Yes, it's your hole, it's your seat, but if the boat goes down, we all go down together." We have to lead by example at Shirat Hayam. We have to demand that this community start having these conversations, coming together, joining together to get past our turf wars and our brand loyalty, false division, our arrogance, our stubbornness, our mean-spiritedness in this community, and yes, our sinat chinam, all of us, and all of our senseless hatred, because we are like the passengers in that boat. And we need to heed the words of Benjamin Franklin when addressing the Congress, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We must indeed all hang together, or indeed each one of us will hang separately. Chaverim kol Yisrael, all Jews are brothers and sisters. It is time for us to unite this house. It is time for us to stand together. It is time for us to be chaverim, to simply be friends. So what do we do, Rabbi? Great big ideas you have, standing on the bima. Once again, don't listen to me. Listen to the experts that we all paid for. Great experts, the best in their fields. Over 10 years ago, Project Solel came along and told us, basically in a nutshell, what did they tell us? Cooperate, collaborate, consolidate, and merge. Fast forward 5 years to 5 years ago, and we had the Sloan Community Task Force. Carl Sloan and a group from Harvard came and they studied, and they put in a tremendous amount of time and effort, pro bono, by the way. And what did they tell us? In a nutshell, cooperate, collaborate, consolidate, and merge. There's too much redundancy in this community. There are too many Jewish professionals, too much staff, too much overhead, too much infrastructure, too many depressing, dilapidated, uninspired buildings, too much mediocrity, too many galas. My God, how many galas can we have in this community? Too much fundraising, asking the same funders for the same funds. Too much lay leadership burnout. Not enough lay leaders. Too few resources and too little time. We need to do what Jewish Family Service had the courage to do a couple of years ago and merge with their sister organization in Boston. We need to do what the Federation had the vision to do this past year and merge with CJP. We need to do what the Jewish Journal is now in the process of doing and collaborating with the Yiddish Forward in New York. My friends, how many brotherhoods and sisterhoods do we need in this community? How many daily minyanim can we possibly have schlepping along on Atlantic Avenue, barely getting a minyan daily, 2 of them a mile apart? How many chesed committees and interfaith outreach committees do we need? How many multiple youth and teen programs do we need? How many separate adult education programs do we need? Does it need to be separate? Can't we all agree that Torah is Torah and study together? How many multiple Hebrew schools do we need? Can we sustain? Should we have a Jewish day school separate from Hebrew schools and synagogues? How many Jewish preschools do we need that are growing more and more non-Jewish every year? Do we need multiple Jewish summer camps? How many conservative synagogues does this community need? Frankly, how many conservative synagogues does any community need? How many synagogues, period, does the North Shore need? Chaverim kol Yisrael, because we are Jews and we are brothers and sisters. It is time for us to get rid of the sinat chinam. It is time for us to be friends. Now look, I am not a psychic. Man, I was so close. I'm not a psychic, not in my family. I'm not a prophet. I don't know what the future looks like, but I do know, and I don't know what cooperate, collaborate, consolidate, and merge exactly means, but I am a student of Jewish history, and I am a student of Torah, and I am a student and believer in this midrash. There were two brothers. They lived on a mountaintop. They were both farmers. One brother was rich and had no children. One brother was poor and had many children. Every night, the other brother was concerned for the other brother's well-being. The rich brother said, I have so much, I have no children. So unbeknownst to his brother, he would drop off a delivery of his crop and put it on his brother's front doorstep. The other brother thought, I have a lot of kids. I'm so wealthy. My brother doesn't have kids. I'll give him some of my crop. So every night he would drop off some of his crop unbeknownst to his brother. This went on for years and years until one day patterns changed. They bumped into each other. And they realized for the past years, brothers had been reaching out to each other, giving unconditionally and completely, and they shed tears and they embraced. And the Midrash says it is on that place where they cried tears of joy and where they embraced as brothers should unite that God built Jerusalem. God built the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Mikdash. It's why it's called Ir Shalom, the city of peace. It is a place that was dedicated and committed to brotherly love. That's what we need to do because it says that is where God is found. Asuli Mikdash, v'shechanti b'tocham. God says to the Israelites, I don't live in bricks and mortar and organizations and institutions. Asuli Mikdash, make for me a sacred space. V'shechanti, and I will dwell not in the space, b'tocham, but in you, in the people, in the Jewish people, in community. When synagogues in this community embrace, not as other but as brothers, God will be found. When Jewish institutions in this community unite, not as competitors but as sisters, God will be found. When Jews in this community embrace, not as enemy, not as others, but as brothers and sisters, as chaverim, God will be found. My friends, this is going to be a year of great change. There will be collaborations, there will be consolidations, there will be mergers, and congregation Shirat Hayam must be at the table. We must lead by example. After all, isn't that what we set out to do over almost 10 years ago? Isn't that what Temple Israel and Temple Bethel set out to do? Not as a final step, but as a first step. Not as an end, but as a means to bridge the divide across Atlantic Avenue, to bridge the divide across this community, to bridge the divide that exists in too many of our hearts. Shirat Hayam was created to inspire. We are the most successful, inspiring synagogue merger, I believe, in the United States of America. We must continue to inspire through collaborating, cooperating, consolidating, and yes, merging. We must remember and remind everybody else that there is no Shirat Hayam. There is no us. There is no them. There is no Temple Sinai. There is no Temple Emmanuel. There is no Chabad, no Habat Shalom, no Temple Shalom, no Camp Menorah, no Camp Simcha, no Aviv, no JCC, no CHA, no CJP, no JFNS, no Jewish Journal. They are us and we are them. Asuli Mikdash, cooperate, collaborate, participate, merge. And that's where God says, that's where I shall be found. Wherever we embrace, that's where our foundation in this community will be poured. Whenever we embrace, that's when and where our future home will be built. And as soon as we embrace, that's when we'll not only survive, but we will thrive. It's time to start acting like a Jewish community, to reach out to our chaverim, like a chevre, like a Jewish community should. And that's where God will be found. Chaverim kol Yisrael, we are Jews, we are brothers and sisters. It's time to stand together. It's time to unite this house. It's time to embrace one another. And as we do, you'll see, we'll get by. Always have, always will, with a little help from our friends. Please join us as we get by with a little help from our friends.
What would you do if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song. I will try not to.
So we open our hearts. You know the words, you know the tune. Now we have to live it.
With little help from my friends. I'm gonna try with little help from my friends. What do I do when my love is away?
Feel free to put your arm around the person next to you and Shiratayam. We are brothers and
How do I
sisters.
feel at the end of the day?
Are you sad because you're on your own?
No, I get by with a little help from my friends.
What happens if everybody sings it? In this building, down the street, across the community.
Oh, I'm gonna try with a little help from my friends.
Our kids are watching. They're listening.
I need somebody to love.
Could it be anybody?
I want somebody to love.
Do you believe in a love at first sight?
Yes, I'm certain that it happens all the time.
What do you see when you turn out the light?
I can't tell you, but I know it's mine. Oh,
I get by with a little help from my friends.
Oh,
I get high with a
I get
little
high
help
with
from
the love of my friends.
yeah, I'm
Gonna try with a little help from my friends. Do you need anybody?
I just need someone to love.
Could it be anybody?
I want somebody to love. Oh, I get
By with a little help from my friends.
L'chaim.
yeah,
I get high with a little help from my friends.
Oh, I'm
Gonna try with a little help from my friends.
Yes, I get by with a little help, with a little help, little help from my
L'chaim. May this be a year of peace and brotherly and sisterly love in this community, in this Jewish community and beyond.